Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 1 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're going to be covering my top 36 ranked wide receivers. Of course, as I share with you guys my thought process and opinions and the statistics that I've gathered in order to justify the current rankings. Now, a couple key things to keep in mind. Specifically, number one, any stat that I mention over the course of today's episode is for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Additionally, rankings are always subject to change. As of this episode, we are not going to be talking about Cooper Kupp, Jerry Jeudy, or Terry McLaurin, as my assumption currently is that they're not going to play in week 1. By the time we get to Sunday, if anything is to change and they are going to play, of course, we'll have updated rankings on our Sunday morning live stream. So you can go ahead, keep up to date on the channel and all the content we'll be producing on a daily basis for the entirety of the 2023 fantasy football by going down below, clicking the subscribe button, and joining the community. Additionally, for those of you who want to continue to stay up to date, besides the live streams, besides the weekly videos, you can go ahead, travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you use code Andrew to sign up and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, you'll get my weekly rankings sent to you from my email to yours personally every single Sunday morning, which includes by position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense, flex additionally, and of course half PPR and full PPR. The primary difference between what I produce on the channel and what is being offered here is the fact that I'm offering flex rankings and full PPR rankings. So take advantage of the opportunity, have rankings every single week for the entirety of the 2023 season, weeks 1 through 18, by using code Andrew. And of course, take advantage of the opportunity of this upcoming Thursday's pick'em of Patrick Mahomes 0.5 overall total yards. Go higher on that. We'll talk about more potential pick'ems in terms of players at the wide receiver position that you might want to, kind of group them with for Thursday night's contest. Check it out. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible, the map on the right side of the screen will determine your eligibility based on your location. Of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. And if you're not eligible or you've potentially already signed up in the past prior to this season, you can go ahead and check out the Patreon link in the description. Thank you very much. The final thing I wanted to mention that is also down in the description is in regards to the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel. The 1.01 brand is officially available now. For those of you who want to continue to support the channel and rep greetings and salutations, you can go ahead, travel down to the description of the video, head on over to andrewkirchhoffshop.com and support there. Greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about my week 1 wide receivers. Of course, we know we're all going to play our studs, primarily with our number 1, Justin Jefferson. He takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Not only are we playing our studs, but we're going to find a lot of production specifically in this matchup, primarily because we have seen Kevin O'Connell, who is a former offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams from 2020 through 2021, play against this Todd Bowles defense with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and find consistent success. In specific, in those 3 games that they played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers from 2020 through 2021, 2 regular season games and 1 playoff game, every single quarterback, whether it was Goff or Stafford, all produced over 340 passing yards in each individual game. Additionally, Cooper Kupp, who pretty much Justin Jefferson is that for the Minnesota Vikings offense. Cooper Kupp in those games, 11 catches, 145, 9 catches, 96 and 2 touchdowns, 9 catches, 183 and a touchdown. Justin Jefferson should have himself a nuclear week 1 and absolutely lead to your success. We know that Justin Jefferson, when given ample opportunity, specifically last year in games with Kirk Cousins, and when he's given 10 or more targets, he's averaging 23.88 half PPR fantasy points per game. Justin Jefferson's an automatic play, as we know. Number 2, we have Ja'Marr Chase. The Cincinnati Bengals take on their division rivals in the Cleveland Browns week 1. The last time we saw Ja'Marr Chase take on this defense, week 14 of last season. T. Higgins was not active in that game, but Ja'Marr Chase absolutely dominated regardless of the fact that there wasn't someone on the other side of the field pulling coverage. We saw Ja'Marr Chase total 15 targets, 10 receptions, 119 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 23.5 fantasy points. Obviously, coming off the injury late in the season, dominated against that secondary. Earlier in the year in week 8, against that defense, he missed because of an injury, and T. Higgins found himself success and was a double-digit fantasy prospect within that given week. If you have both these wide receivers out there, a healthy Joe Burrow, a better offensive line, I anticipate Ja'Marr Chase to continue to find success against the division rival. Moving on to number 3, we have Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill takes on the Los Angeles Chargers. And similar to the game between the Cincinnati Bengals and Cleveland Browns, the Miami Dolphins taking on the Los Angeles Chargers are one of the highest implied totals in terms of over-unders. 51 implied points in this game, the second highest going into the week outside of the Kansas City versus Detroit game. So with that current anticipation, I'm expecting, of course, Tyreek Hill to continue his reign of success against the Los Angeles Chargers. Again, considering the fact that he played for the Kansas City Chiefs and they played against the Chargers twice a year over the course of his entire career thus far, we have seen Tyreek Hill torch this defense regardless of who's covering him, regardless of what season. I mean, the last time he took on the Los Angeles Chargers was last year, specifically with the Miami Dolphins, 4 receptions, 81 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, scored 22.1 fantasy points. One of those receptions were for 70 yards down the sideline for a touchdown. Another touchdown that he scored was a fumble by Jaylen Waddle in which he scooped it up and ran for 57 yards in a touchdown. He's an explosive player and he's going to find success. You even go back to 2021 with the Chiefs, week 15. Tyreek Hill totaled 13 targets, 12 receptions, 148 and a touchdown for 26.8 fantasy points against the Los Angeles Chargers defense. His speed is purely unmatched. And the fact of the matter is, even though last season's game against the Los Angeles Chargers, the Miami Dolphins had his worst performance in which he went 10 for 28 passing, started the game 0 for 11, I anticipate this offense to get to a hot start and find a lot of success in a potential shootout. Our number 4 for this week is CeeDee Lamb, taking on a division rival, the New York Giants. CeeDee Lamb last season in the 2 games in which he played against his team, whether it was with or without Dak Prescott, found a lot of success. But we all know from week 7 through 18, once Dak Prescott returned, CeeDee Lamb was a significantly better fantasy prospect, averaging 16.1 fantasy points per game in the 11 remaining games of the season. Now, specifically in week 3 with Cooper Rush, he still scored 18.7 fantasy points against this defense, 8 catches, 87 and a touchdown. Week 12 against the New York Giants, 6 catches, 106 for 14.7 fantasy points. We've seen him find success, and luckily for him going into this matchup, specifically the Giants starting cornerbacks this season are both rookies. I expect CeeDee Lamb to be able to take advantage of their experience and dominate. Our number 5 for this week is Amon-Ra St. Brown, the thumbnail of today's episode. Amon-Ra St. Brown, if in fact he wants to get into the S tier, he needs to find a touchdown of upside in order to get within that overall elite production level. So as of this current moment in time, like we can see via Underdog Fantasy, he's expected a higher or lower number of 7 receptions, 78.5 receiving yards, and 14.5 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. As of this current moment in time, just think about the production that we've talked about for Amon-Ra St. Brown all offseason. In 18 of his last 20 healthy games, he has surpassed 6 or more receptions. Specifically last season in the games in which he was healthy, averaging 14.99 fantasy points per game with this offense. With this implied over-under of 54 points, I know Travis Kelce's a little bit banged up. That might decrease the overall total. But with the implied total of this game being a potential shootout on Thursday night, I'm anticipating the Lions to bring the fight to the Kansas City defense and Amon-Ra St. Brown to absolutely dominate going into this upcoming matchup with all the expected overall statistics being at an extremely high level and being the number 1 receiving option of this offense. Moving on, we have our number 5, Davante Adams. Davante Adams found himself a lot of success last season against the Detroit Lions. That's a given. Even though we are going from Derek Carr to Jimmy Garoppolo, I do expect Davante Adams to be able to dominate because even though he was going up against Patrick Surtain II last year, Davante Adams torched the Denver Broncos defense. In one game, 13 targets, 9 catches, 101, 15 fantasy points. And in the Week 11 contest, 13 targets, 7 catches, 141, and 2 receiving touchdowns for 29.6 fantasy points. Specifically, the yardage and the overall receptions that Patrick Surtain allowed in terms of overall statistics. In the Week 4 matchup, allowed 7 catches and 60 yards. In the Week 11 matchup, allowed 5 receptions, 106, and 2 touchdowns in man coverage. I expect Davante Adams, the veteran, to continue to go ahead and show Patrick Surtain that it's going to take him a couple more years to get to the level of covering Davante Adams. We did see Jimmy Garoppolo take on the Denver defense last season. Early on in the season, went 18 for 29 passing overall. In comparison to Derek Carr, who in the last 2 games against the Denver Broncos was 40-plus passing attempts, we may end up seeing that number for Jimmy Garoppolo. And if we are going to, Davante Adams' targets are only going up, and so will his fantasy points. Our number 7 for today's episode is A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown going up against the New England Patriots. I mean, again, it's going to be a difficult matchup. Bill Belichick is going to try to take away Jalen Hurts' favorite target. But there are so many receiving threats within this offense that are potent. So it's absolutely going to be difficult to choose which one you want to go ahead and take out of the overall contest. That being said, A.J. Brown's going to be very difficult to kind of wash away with double coverage. Even in those scenarios, you go back to last season, this guy's making catches in double coverage over 3 defenders, dominating. Last season with Jalen Hurts from weeks 1 through 15 was averaging 15.22 half PPR fantasy points per game. And the fact of the matter is, the Patriots defense, specifically even last year, but this goes for the last couple seasons. In fact, Bill Belichick has heavily struggled in terms of stopping opposing mobile quarterbacks. When we go back to last season, the New England Patriots lost against Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen twice, and Justin Fields. And if we're potentially anticipating, and this is what kind of the overall sports books are looking like, that this game is going to be the Philadelphia Eagles only being a 3.5 point favorite going into the game A close game between these two teams only promotes more passing for Jalen Hurts and more receiving upside for someone like A.J. Brown. I anticipate this offense to absolutely air it out if they're not able to find some sort of rhythm within the running game. They're obviously still trying to figure out what their rotation is going to be between Swift, Gainwell, and Penny. But if we go ahead and look at the overall statistics in terms of what Jalen Hurts produced last season, amongst all quarterbacks in first half passing attempts was number 8 with 293. Now that script completely changed in the second half of games because this team was a first half team and continued to score the most points per game in first halves throughout the 2022 season. In the second half, Jalen Hurts was the number 24 quarterback in terms of total passing attempts with 167. There is a lot to be said about the potential of this offense, especially if they're in far more competitive matchups and the upside for their receiving options. Our number 8 for this week and closing out the A tier is Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs has the privilege of taking on Sauce Gardner. The coverage is absolutely going to be difficult. And the last time Josh Allen, Stefon Diggs took on this defense, of course, Josh Allen had to deal with that elbow injury. And that was absolutely a determining factor as to the potential upside of someone like Stefon Diggs. But in the last 2 matchups against this defense, week 9 of last year, 11.8 fantasy points, 10 targets, 5 catches, 93 yards. Additionally, in week 14's matchup, really wasn't a factor. 3 receptions on 5 targets, 37 receiving yards, 5.2 fantasy points. We all know that Stefon Diggs is not happy when he's not targeted and not a focal point of this offense. I'm sure Josh Allen's going to be able to course correct if in fact we're getting into a position where he's not highly utilized in this game. They're smart enough to be able to put him into situations where Sauce Gardner is not going to be tailing him the entire game. And if Sauce Gardner wants to move into the slot and play nickel and be able to cover him, so be it. I think Stefon Diggs still going to find success because he's one of these stud wide receivers. All right, let's go to our B tier. Beginning with our number 9, we have Garrett Wilson. In the same matchup, Garrett Wilson has the privilege of taking on Tre'Davious White. Last season, when he took on the Buffalo Bills defense, only in the Week 14 matchup did he have an opportunity of taking on Tre'Davious White. In that matchup, 6 catches, 78 yards, 10.8 fantasy points with Mike White under center. Now, in the previous game in Week 9, in which the New York Jets actually beat the Buffalo Bills last season with Zach Wilson under center, there was no Tre'Davious White, and it was apparent based on the overall statistics that Garrett Wilson was able to accumulate with 8 catches, 92 yards, and 13.9 fantasy points. Regardless of who's covering in this here, the fact that you have Aaron Rodgers under center is only going to elevate his overall game. This is going to be an exciting matchup on Monday Night Football. Our number 10 for this week is DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf obviously takes on the Los Angeles Rams this week. He has a privilege of taking them on every single year, twice a year, specifically last season. In the Week 13 matchup, 22.7 fantasy points, 8 catches on 8 targets, 127 and a touchdown. Unfortunately, in the Week 18 matchup in which they ran the ball a boatload with Kenneth Walker, 29 rushing attempts, there wasn't enough offensive opportunity for someone like DK Metcalf, only getting himself 8 targets and only actualizing 4 receptions, 40 receiving yards, 5.5 fantasy points. Not the greatest overall number, but we're going to see a difference in this overall Rams defense, primarily because there's no more Jalen Ramsey. The youth that is within that secondary is significant, and it's going to play a factor because last season, Geno Smith struggled at times against his secondary. Geno Smith turned over the ball and had 3 interceptions in the 2 games against the Los Angeles Rams last year. Going into this upcoming matchup, I think it's going to be a far easier overall opportunity for guys like DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett to find success. Specifically, when we talk about the 2 games in which they took on this defense, wide receivers as a whole, their overall fantasy contributions in those 2 games, Week 13, 48.8 fantasy points, and in Week 18, 25.4. Success will be found. Geno will be better, and the secondary not having Jalen Ramsey will make a difference for DK Metcalf. Our number 11 is Chris Olave for this week. Chris Olave takes on the Tennessee Titans. The Tennessee Titans last season, amongst all defenses, gave up the most points per game to opposing wide receivers. And even though they've tried to bring in other prospects in order to try to help the fact that they cannot stop a soul in the passing game, the fact of the matter is, teams have to pass the ball up against the Tennessee Titans because no one really will find success running the ball against them. Last season, they allowed the second fewest fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics alone to opposing running backs. Like I mentioned yesterday in regards to Jamal Williams, the Tennessee Titans allowed 3.7 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. That in itself will lead to this offense throwing the ball for majority of the game. And if that's going to be the case, the number 1 receiving option, Chris Olave of this offense, should be able to dominate. His current number via Underdog Fantasy, 64.5 receiving yards. In comparison to all the other receivers on the Pickens list, he has a relatively high number. The expectation is good. He's going to be utilized early and often, and especially considering we have seen Derek Carr take on this defense last season. Against Tennessee, went 26 for 44 passing, 303 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Wasn't efficient in terms of his passing completion percentage, but now within a new offense, new weapons, Derek Carr could be even better this upcoming season. All right, let's move on to our number 12 to close out the wide receiver one conversation. We close out with Jaylen Waddle. Jaylen Waddle, similar to someone like Tyreek Hill, obviously has the home run potential. That's the kind of wide receivers that they are. Now, last season against the Los Angeles Chargers in the Week 14 matchup, Jaylen Waddle was all quiet. 2 catches, 4 targets, 31 receiving yards, 4.1 fantasy points. But like I've mentioned before already this week, Tua in that matchup was 10 for 28 passing and started the game 0 for 11. I mean, that is one of the worst starts in NFL history by a quarterback, outside of Nathan Peterman throwing 4 interceptions in the first half of that game, if you guys remember a long time ago. Nonetheless, when we're talking about the target share within this offense, with no more Mike Gesicki, with running backs out of this backfield not really being utilized much when Tua is under center, he doesn't really like to check it down often. He is looking for either Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. They are the number 1 and 2, and they're going to both find success in this given week. When you have someone like Tyreek Hill on the opposite side of the field, pulling double coverage every single play, it's only going to open up more utilization for someone like Jaylen Waddle. All right, our number 13 is Calvin Ridley. The Jacksonville Jaguars take on their division rivals in the Indianapolis Colts this week. Even though the Indianapolis Colts, in terms of personnel, still have a good run-stopping defense, in terms of a secondary, they perhaps have one of the worst secondaries in terms of cornerbacks in the National Football League. Last year, they had Stephon Gilmore, Isaiah Rodgers, and Kenny Moore. Specifically, Stephon Gilmore and Isaiah Rodgers were 2 of the top 10 overall graded coverage cornerbacks in the National Football League by Pro Football Focus last season. So the fact that you lose both of them, and now you have Flowers and Brents, a rookie cornerback, trying to fill into their spots. You still have Kenny Moore, who's going to play in the nickel and be that slot cornerback. But ultimately, Calvin Ridley on the outside is going up against inexperienced secondary members and should be able to take the top off this defense, specifically the wide receivers of the Jacksonville Jaguars against the Colts last season, weeks 2 and week 6. They combined for 31.5 fantasy points and 20.9 fantasy points in those 2 matchups. Overall, great production. We're anticipating upside for Calvin Ridley. Number 14 is Keenan Allen. We've talked about this Miami versus Los Angeles matchup a lot. Again, we're expecting a very high-scoring game. The implied total is relatively high. So if Keenan Allen is going to continue his success that he found last season in the Week 14 matchup, in which he went 14 targets, 12 receptions, 92 receiving yards, and 15.2 fantasy points, again, we're expecting success. You got to remember, Keenan Allen late last season, once he returned from injury, from weeks 11 through 18, was averaging 15.04 fantasy points per game. With Justin Herbert throughout his entire career since 2020, has averaged over 14.3 half PPR fantasy points per game. The current matchup going into this week, in terms of the nickel cornerback that is going to be covering Keenan Allen, is Kader Kohou. He's the primary nickel for this defense, and amongst all cornerbacks last season who played in the slot, he gave up the 4th most targets, 6th most receptions, and 15th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers in the slot position. And specifically last season in this matchup, gave up 11 receptions, 83 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown to opposing wide receivers from the Chargers. I'm expecting Keenan Allen to find a lot of success. Our number 15 for this week is Slim Reaper. It is DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith last season within this offense was averaging 12.8 fantasy points per game throughout the entirety of the 2022 regular season. Of course, continued to find success in the NFL playoffs in games in which they really had to utilize him. But there were many circumstances in which they were blowing out teams and he didn't get much utilization. Like I mentioned with A.J. Brown, the fact that Jalen Hurts in the first half of games last season had the 8th most passing attempts amongst all quarterbacks, but in the second half of games last season was ranked 24th amongst all quarterbacks, gives you an idea as to how great this team is and the expectation that they may be running the ball in the second half of games. If it's going to be a closer matchup up against Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots, and of course Mac Jones is going to keep this competitive, it's only going to help guys like DeVonta Smith and A.J. Brown, of course Dallas Goedert, find fantasy relevance in the second half, which typically over the course of all of last season, despite the fact that DeVonta Smith finished with 90 receptions at the end of the regular season, they didn't really play much in second half of games. Moving on to our number 16. To begin the D tier, we have Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper takes on the Cincinnati Bengals last season in the Week 8 matchups in which he had Jacoby Brissett. It was a Thursday night game. I clearly remember it. Amari Cooper went off, 20.6 fantasy points, 5 receptions, 131 and a touchdown. But unfortunately, in the Week 14 matchup, of course, we didn't see much of Amari Cooper. 2 catches on 7 targets, 42 receiving yards. And unfortunately, the inconsistencies of Deshaun Watson having, a 50% passing completion percentage throughout the back end of games certainly didn't help Amari Cooper in that overall circumstance. Nonetheless, in that Week 14 matchup, Donovan Peoples-Jones was able to ball out. We did see about 25 fantasy points accumulated from Cleveland Browns wide receivers in that game. I'm anticipating, again, a higher scoring matchup between these two teams. Therefore, with more experience and a full offseason of, kind of rapport building between Deshaun Watson and Amari Cooper, he should be a great option. Moving on to 17, we have T. Higgins. Again, like I mentioned earlier with Jamar Chase, T. Higgins in the Week 8 matchup was alone. There was no Jamar Chase within the lineup, and as the wide receiver one taking on the Cleveland Browns last season, in Week 8, he had 3 receptions on 6 targets, 49 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 12.4 fantasy points. Now, in the following game, in Week 14, obviously missed it due to injury, but overall, this offense, against this secondary in specific, 28.4 fantasy points from wide receivers, 40.2. They're going to light up the scoreboard. They're going to continue to utilize these stud wide receivers. Now that they're both healthy, it's only going to elevate each other's play. T. Higgins should have himself a great week. Our number 18 for this week is Tyler Lockett. Similar to DK Metcalf finding success because of the fact that there is no Jalen Ramsey, and this defense is going to be far less than what they have been in the past, considering their personnel changes. Tyler Lockett should continue his streak of success against this defense. Specifically last year, in the 2 matchups against the Los Angeles Rams, weeks 13 and 18, 23.3 fantasy points, 9 catches, 128 and a touchdown, and 13.4 fantasy points, 4 catches, 54 and a touchdown. Tyler Lockett last year averaged 12.21 fantasy points per game, was able to put up 10 or more fantasy points in 12 of his 17 games last season. The consistency is there. The offense is obviously going to be able to take advantage of the secondary not having much experience and being a younger group. Tyler Lockett against the Los Angeles Rams should be a great play. Our number 19 for this week is Mike Williams. Mike Williams, again, another high-scoring matchup. We're going back into the conversation of the Los Angeles Chargers versus the Miami Dolphins. Again, if it wasn't already apparent thus far, based on the fact that where we have Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle, Keenan Allen, and now Mike Williams ranked, this should be a very high-scoring game. And hopefully we'll see Mike Williams put up numbers that he did last season in the Week 14 matchup against Miami. 6 catches, 116 and a touchdown for 20.6 fantasy points, even with Keenan Allen active in that game. So it wasn't a matter of like, oh, he got the opportunity only because Keenan Allen wasn't there. It was all systems go for the offense, and they demonstrated that, and they put up a great amount of points. Specifically, last season, Mike Williams in the 11 healthy games throughout the regular season in which he participated in, averaged 12.53 fantasy points per game. The expected coverage as of this week should either be Xavier Howard or Eli Apple. Specifically against Xavier Howard in man coverage last year, had 5 receptions for 106 against them in that game. So I'm anticipating a lot more success. A 51-point over-under implied total leads to perhaps even Mike Williams finding the end zone and even being better than the number 19 overall wide receiver. Our number 20 for this week is Christian Watson. We all know Christian Watson is a home run hitter. It really just takes one play and he can get the job done and be a significantly better ranked wide receiver than number 20 overall. That being said, in the 2 games in which he played against the Chicago Bears last year, in week 2, had no utilization, did not play at all, only had 2.4 fantasy points, 3 targets, 3 receptions. But ultimately, in the Week 18 matchup against Chicago, 3 catches, 48 and a touchdown, and also had a rushing attempt for 46 yards and a touchdown, was able to put up 22.9 fantasy points. In the back end of the season, in the final 8 games in which pretty much Christian Watson was the number 1 receiving options of this offense, he had 31 receptions in 8 games. So about just under less than 4 receptions per game. And that's why his number, as of right now via Underdog Fantasy, in terms of the pick'em, higher or lower, is 4 receptions and 45.5 receiving yards. Listen, the last time I saw Jordan Love play with Christian Watson was late in that Philadelphia game last season. He threw a slant to Christian Watson. He went for 70 yards and a touchdown. I'm expecting big time, big playmaking ability from Christian Watson. That's what we anticipated all offseason, and we're hoping that comes to fruition. Our number 21 for this week is DeAndre Hopkins. They take on the New Orleans Saints, and the Tennessee Titans should be able to find success on the ground and through the air. And luckily, with a healthy DeAndre Hopkins, Ryan Tannehill, and Treylon Burks, this should be a passing attack that is going to be utilized quite frequently throughout the entirety of this game. Now, last season, DeAndre Hopkins with the Arizona Cardinals had the privilege of taking on the New Orleans Saints defense. Unfortunately, in that game, Marshawn Lattimore was not active. He was out. So even though DeAndre Hopkins was able to accumulate 10 receptions for 103 receiving yards against that defense, it wasn't really against their top corner who's going to be present in week 1. So at this current moment in time, I'm anticipating DeAndre Hopkins to probably pull a bracket, get double covered for a majority of the game. But with that even being the case, if we remember who the current offensive coordinator is and new offensive coordinator for the Tennessee Titans, Tim Kelly, he was the former offensive coordinator for the Houston Texans in 2019 and in 2020. He's familiar with DeAndre Hopkins. They're going to help him find success this season. Our number 22 for this week is Chris Godwin. They take on the Minnesota Vikings. I'm anticipating the Minnesota Vikings to score a lot of points, which is going to force, of course, the Baker Mayfield-led Tampa Bay Buccaneers to throw for a majority of that second half. And if that's going to be the case, hopefully we'll find numbers very similar to what exactly Chris Godwin was capable of producing last season in 12 of his 15 games in which he participated in. Had 5 or more receptions and 50 or more receiving yards. So we can find ourselves a baseline of 7.5 points, and then anything on top of it based on the overall game script, the red zone utilization, and hopefully a potential touchdown in this given week we'll find Chris Godwin finding himself a lot of success. Specifically, the coverage that we're anticipating is Byron Murphy Jr. He might be the slot cornerback. I don't know how they want to run their defense. I don't know if they're going to put Byron Murphy on someone like Mike Evans and how exactly the Minnesota Vikings secondary is going to be utilized. All I know is that their front seven is significantly better than their back end secondary. Harrison Smith is obviously past his prime. They didn't really address the secondary position like I would have wanted them to this offseason to improve it. So this should be an advantageous matchup for the Tampa Bay receiving options. Moving on to our number 23, it is Deebo Samuel. In the last 5 games, he's participated with Brock Purdy, averaging 11.64 half PPR fantasy points per game. We have seen the Pittsburgh Steelers make incredible improvements in terms of their secondary, bringing in Patrick Peterson, Desmond King, and drafting Joey Porter Jr. This is going to be a difficult matchup for this offense, and it's going to be a slugfest. And honestly, I don't know who's going to win this game, but it should be fun to watch. Nonetheless, even though the coverage is going to be difficult, you got to remember how they use Deebo Samuel. They can have him rush the ball out of the backfield. They can give him bubbles, slants, jet sweeps, anything to get the ball in his hands so that they can get blockers in front of him and let him pretty much gather yards after the catch or, pretty much after contact. I'm expecting Deebo Samuel to still find success regardless of the fact that they're playing against a tough Pittsburgh Steelers defense. Number 24 to close out our top 24 conversation is Diontae Johnson. In this same matchup, again, we're anticipating the 49ers defense, who is great in terms of their run-stopping prowess, elite, in fact, in that overall category, to force Najee Harris and, of course, Jaylen Warren to not find success early. It'll force a lot of third and long scenarios, which, of course, Diontae Johnson comes knocking. Last season, in the 10 healthy games in which Kenny Pickett played with Diontae Johnson, he was averaging 8.5 targets per game in his direction. We will probably see Charvarius Ward pulled in the direction of Diontae Johnson, but if he starts pulling in the direction of someone like George Pickens, it's only going to help Diontae Johnson's bottom line within the given week. Should be a fun matchup. And of course, the number 1 receiving option of the Pittsburgh Steelers in the game in which they're going to be passing for majority of the contest should lead to success. Number 25 is Jahan Dotson. All right, so here's the thing about Jahan Dotson. I'm anticipating that Terry McLaurin is going to miss this week. And hopefully Terry McLaurin can get back from that, turf toe injury sooner rather than later for fantasy purposes, because it's only going to help elevate the Washington Commanders offense. But in his absence, going up against the Arizona Cardinals, I'm anticipating Marco Wilson to be the number 1 corner coverage that is going to be designated to cover Jahan Dotson for a majority of this game. Even if that's going to be the case, the fact that the other side of the ball, the fact that the Arizona Cardinals offense has Clayton Tune as their starting quarterback, he might shock the world. You never know. But my anticipation and the experience that I have in terms of watching football, typically a 5th round rookie quarterback can't just come out of nowhere in week 1 and take on a defense of this caliber and be able to light them up. So I'm anticipating Washington to have a lot of opportunities. And if that's going to be the case, Sam Howell should be looking to his number 1, Jahan Dotson, just like he has all preseason, and finding success. Number 26 is Brandin Aiyuk, another one of these receivers within this San Francisco versus Pittsburgh game. From weeks 13 through 18 of last season, with Purdy under center, we saw Brandin Aiyuk accumulating 6.7 targets per game and 10.6 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, was the number 18 overall wide receiver in fantasy football because he was consistent, finding the end zone, and of course, a boatload of yardage. Like I mentioned earlier with Deebo Samuel, the overall coverage of this defense has significantly improved with Patrick Peterson, Desmond King coming over from the Houston Texans, and drafting Joey Porter Jr. If these guys are going to lock up someone like Brandin Aiyuk, I wouldn't be surprised, but they're going to set him up for a lot of opportunities in terms of slant routes that could end up leading to a lot of yak yards after the catch, which should be able to keep him fantasy relevant for week 1. Moving on to our number 27, we have Courtland Sutton. Now, my anticipation for this offense is the fact that Jerry Jeudy is most likely not going to play. Javonte Williams may be on a snap count of sorts, and depending on how they want to utilize Greg Dulcich, I guess it's to be determined based on the week 1 utilization. Courtland Sutton is the most experienced receiving option and has the most rapport with Russell Wilson within this offense going into week 1. Last season, in the 2 games in which Courtland Sutton took on the Las Vegas Raiders defense, he had himself 5 catches, 52 and a touchdown for 13.7 fantasy points in week 4. And in week 11, had himself 5 catches for 80 yards and 10.5 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. I know that the Raiders signed Marcus Peters this offseason, but regardless of who's covering, if majority, if not all of the targets are going to be going in the direction of Courtland Sutton, he should find success as a wide receiver 3 with upside, hopefully finding the end zone in the given week's matchup. Our number 28 for this week is Drake London. Last season, in the games in which Desmond Ridder was the starting quarterback from weeks 15 through 18, Drake London averaged 9 targets, 6.3 receptions, 83.3 receiving yards per game, and 10.5 fantasy points per game. Despite that being the case, there was no Kyle Pitts, there was no Matt Collins, there was no Bijan Robinson. And with those guys joining this offense, it's going to provide more competition for targets for Drake London. Despite the fact that he is the number one wide receiver option of this team, it's still going to be a little bit more difficult. In the two matchups in which he took on the Carolina Panthers last season, it was purely a run-first approach. And with having Marcus Mariota at quarterback, there was inconsistencies of overall opportunity. So having only 4 receptions for 31 yards and 5.1 fantasy points in the Week 8 matchup, getting himself 5 catches, 38 and a touchdown in the Week 10 matchup, barely getting over double-digit fantasy points with those overall lack of opportunities. We'll take it, but expect J.C. Horn to be in coverage against Drake London. If that's going to be the case for Desmond Ridder, may be difficult. Our number 29 is Christian Kirk. He's taking on Kenny Moore, who is the most experienced cornerback of this overall defense. Like I mentioned earlier in regards to Calvin Ridley, with no Stephon Gilmore or Isaiah Rodgers returning in this secondary, 2 of the top 10 graded overall cornerbacks in terms of coverage last season by Pro Football Focus, it'll definitely be a little bit more difficult for Christian Kirk, who's taking on Kenny Moore. But last season against Kenny Moore, 10 total receptions on 11 targets, had himself over 100 receiving yards, and additionally had himself 3 receiving touchdowns against that Indianapolis Colts defense in the 2 games combined, putting up over 30 fantasy points in those 2 games combined. So if we're going to see another big game in which Christian Kirk can find the end zone, he could end up scoring 15 plus points and being a solid wide receiver 2 with upside, if not a wide receiver 1, and get himself into that top 12, even beyond what Calvin Ridley is able to produce. Either way, I'm anticipating a lot of success from the Jacksonville Jaguars offense. I'm just thinking this is going to be a game in which, if in fact the Colts offense isn't able to get off the ground quickly, they may be running the ball for majority of the second half, which will limit other receiving options like a Christian Kirk in terms of his overall upside of production. Number 30 is DJ Moore. The biggest problem I have with DJ Moore this week isn't Justin Fields, isn't the fact that he's the number 1 receiving option of this offense. It's the fact that they take on the Green Bay Packers. And Jair Alexander lining up against them is going to be a nightmare. Jair Alexander can lock up a guy like Justin Jefferson. So he is absolutely capable of covering someone like DJ Moore. DJ Moore in the preseason found his 2 most successful plays in terms of yards after the catch, being able to catch a bubble and going to the house, being able to catch a ball in the middle of the field and no one being able to tackle him and him running down the sideline. There is potential in which DJ Moore could still be relevant for fantasy purposes. I'm just keeping in mind the coverage at cornerback is tough for this week. Moving on to our 31, we have Mike Evans. Mike Evans, again, similar to Chris Godwin, should be able to benefit from the fact that they're taking on Minnesota. Their secondary is not great, and it's going to be a game in which the Tampa Bay Buccaneers should be trailing for majority of the game. With that being the case, Mike Evans should see a lot of opportunity in the receiving game. With this secondary pretty much lacking in terms of overall skill, I know Mike Evans was highly inconsistent last year, and that's why I have him as a low-end wide receiver 3, because outside of the games in which he scores touchdowns, he is going to be highly inconsistent due to the lack of receptions and yardage that he's able to accumulate after. So we're hoping for a touchdown down in the red zone. Otherwise, Mike Evans, a wide receiver 3 at best. Moving on, let's talk about George Pickens, our number 32. Again, it's a difficult matchup, but we're anticipating Kenny Pickett and the Pittsburgh Steelers to throw for majority of this game. And if that's going to be the case, it's not just going to be Diontae Johnson hauling in a bunch of overall targets. It has to be George Pickens getting involved. Against a defense that is elite in terms of stopping the run, George Pickens sure can run block, he can body some people, but the fact of the matter is, in year 2, George Pickens needs to step up. He needs to immediately be that guy that can be relied upon to make plays. In 6 of his last 8 games in 2022, he had more than 50 receiving yards. I'm anticipating a lot of success and a lot of utilization for George Pickens early and often within this contest. Moving on to our number 33, we have Michael Pittman Jr. I am truly hoping for Michael Pittman Jr. to find success. I don't want anybody to score a lack of fantasy points. I want everyone to score for fantasy purposes, but it's going to be a matter of whether Anthony Richardson can elevate Michael Pittman Jr. to make him fantasy relevant. When I go back to last season, 2022, in the 3 games in which Michael Pittman Jr. played with Sam Ehlinger under center, he was averaging 6.7 targets, 4.3 receptions, 35 receiving yards, 0.33 touchdowns, and 7.7 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. There's no way that Anthony Richardson is worse than Sam Ehlinger. There should be an opportunity in which Michael Pittman Jr. at very minimum could be able to score 8 to 11 fantasy points and a half PPR, if not better in a full PPR, of course. So we're hoping, crossing our fingers, that Anthony Richardson shows up and balls out. Moving on to our number 34, we have Jordan Addison. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the Minnesota Vikings offense should be able to light up this Tampa Bay defense. Even though Tampa Bay's secondary has themselves a lot of great players, the fact of the matter is Kevin O'Connell and the way that the Rams of the past and now the Minnesota Vikings of the future have gone ahead and taken on Todd Bowles and their defense, they've been able to dice him up. The last 3 quarterbacks against this defense, Goff, Stafford in the last 3 games in which, of course, Kevin O'Connell was the offensive coordinator of those games. 51 attempts, 376 and 3 touchdowns. 343 and 4 touchdowns. 38 attempts, 366 and 2 touchdowns. I'm anticipating Kirk Cousins, of course, to go ahead and find as your rookie wide receiver early in this game and find a lot of success. Moving on to our number 35, we have Michael Thomas. Again, like I mentioned earlier with Chris Olave, the anticipation is that the Tennessee Titans, a secondary that allowed the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers last season, primarily because of the fact that no one can run the ball on the Tennessee Titans, giving up only 3.7 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs last season. Their primary front seven is intact and healthy and ready to go. So if in fact the New Orleans Saints are not able to find themselves success on the ground, it is going to be forced through the air. Last season, from weeks 1 through 3, when Michael Thomas was healthy, was able to accumulate 16 receptions, 171 and 3 touchdowns, 43.1 fantasy points in just 3 weeks. Hopefully, Derek Carr, who has experience against Tennessee last season, is going to be able to bring that in immediately and find a lot of success with his receiving threats. Moving on to the final option, our number 36, it is Brandin Cooks. Again, like I mentioned with CeeDee Lamb, the anticipation is that going up against 2 rookie cornerbacks should lead to both CeeDee Lamb and Brandin Cooks finding immediate success. Now, specifically in the game in which Dak Prescott took on the New York Giants last season, 21 of 30 passing, 70% passing completion percentage, 261 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. I know Michael Gallup is an active part of this offense. We don't know how much utilization we're going to see from Jake Ferguson and the tight ends of this team. Tony Pollard will get himself a sprinkle of receptions, but ultimately the wide receivers of this offense are going to be able to carry them in this given week. I think Brandin Cooks is a solid potential flex start as a wide receiver 3 going into this given week. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. That covers our top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 1 of the 2023 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, if you have not yet already and you want daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season, be sure to subscribe down below. Check out Underdog Fantasy if you guys want my rankings every single Sunday morning from my email to yours by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, included with flex rankings. Again, something that I never present here on the channel in terms of content. You can find it available there, or you can go ahead and check out the Patreon. Either way, take advantage of the opportunity. Help me help you this season. And until tomorrow, we'll be talking about quarterbacks or tight ends. I'll see you guys. Peace.